Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for coming back to Listening In, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society podcast. In this series, we want to give you the opportunity to listen in to some of the conversations that we are lucky enough to have every day. That is, with a variety of people and organisations all working in the field of mental health and well-being. Today we are delighted to welcome a man whose interest in human behaviour began with the story of someone he had never met. The grandfather of Simon Coombs was a dispatch rider who served at Dunkirk and the D-Day landings. But he returned deeply changed by war. That family legacy sparked a lifelong curiosity in Simon about how experiences can shape people. Despite a lack of direction in his early working life, Simon went on to become one of the UK's early behavioural coaches for business. And along the way, this work opened another window for Simon into the complex realities of mental health, particularly as colleagues began sharing struggles that extended far beyond the workplace. After going through multiple redundancies himself, each bringing with it its own challenges to his mental health, family, and sense of identity, Simon turned these experiences into purpose. Determined to make support for the jobless more accessible, he launched an initiative offering talking therapies to long-term unemployed individuals. This achieved remarkable results and drew the attention of policymakers at the highest level. So today, through his organisation Working Minds, Simon's work can be seen to be deeply rooted in lived experience, professional insight, and yet can be traced all the way back to the beaches of Dunkirk. I said when I first emailed you, and you were kind enough to sort of send some thoughts back, that I think what we really enjoy about doing this and what we find people are really interested in, as much as it is about obviously the work you do now, which we'll come on to, is the story about how you got into doing that, because we've all got our stories, haven't we? And as I'm always saying, counsellors are humans too. So we have our own struggles and challenges and traumas also that inform so much of our practice at the end of the day, don't they? So you were brilliant at sending a brief autobiography. And it really struck me, Simon, how actually it was your grandfather who you never met, but stories about him started to become some of those very first sort of curious thoughts for you about humans and human behaviour.
You know, I'm one of three. I grew up in Surrey, but I was born in London, in South London, in Tooting. And my mum and dad lived there, but my parents were. There's a kind of a war theme through this bit. So my mother lived in London during the Blitz, during World War II, and in the end, she was eventually evacuated with her four younger brothers to South Wales.
Okay.
As many children were, weren't they? But the four of them went, and she met my dad there. When they were both kids during those times, and evidently they got on very well. So I think they were about 11 or 12, something like that. But my grandmother was very poorly and was and she had TB. So when they came back to London, they were looked after by the rest of the family, that extended family that rallied round and so on. But my mother's dad was a dispatch rider during World War II, George. And George was was a very good-natured family man up until the break out of World War II. And as I say, he became a dispatch rider, but during and prior to that time, so he experienced a lot of stuff, and we call it in our sort of world now as therapists, we call it war theatre. Sounds a bit. I've never been quite comfortable with that because I quite like going to the theatre when I get a chance. But the worst kind of theatre, if you like. But he experienced some terrible things. He went to Dunkirk, so he was on the beaches at Dunkirk, and his best friend lost his life next to him in the most horrific fashion, which I won't go into right now, but you can imagine. And as a dispatch rider, he was back and forth to the front lines and with orders and so on. And so he was in the heat of it all the time, and he saw, I can't imagine what he saw. And interestingly, I mean, coming out of all of that, the changes within him must have been profound. But some stories that stick with me, I mean, quite bizarrely, after D-Day and after everything had shaken down a bit, coming back on a troop carrier, and he looked across at this massively packed out troop carrier, and he saw his brother there out of the hundreds of thousands of people that were up and down the beaches, and he saw his brother, which was quite remarkable. But the other thing that stayed in my mind, that my mother said, when he came home from that trip, if you like, he went upstairs and she didn't see him for 3 days, and he slept for 3 days. Obviously, other than going to the toilet probably, but he slept solidly for 3 days. So the amount of processing that the mind must have had to do. So life sort of settled down after the war, but he was a changed man because of what he saw, and he became a violent man, a very angry man, something that my mother and her younger siblings just didn't recognise, and obviously my grandmother didn't either. And the only place where he found any peace was in the local pub with all his mates, and all his mates, of course, had served as well. Yeah. And of course the alcohol. So those two things unfortunately came hand in hand, and he split up from my grandmother. He went to live in St Albans. So therefore I never met him, but I heard these stories about him, and it just grew a profound curiosity in me at that point, and I think I started to hear these stories as a young teenager, probably about 13, perhaps 12, 13 or whatever, and started to wonder about what that must have been like for him, and so on. Still wasn't probably old enough to go deeper than that, but to the fact that my mother didn't see him again from about 16 years of age or something like that was a real sadness. So that was where that kind of initial thinking began about the human condition.
Yeah, that impact, isn't it, on your grandfather and on the wider family. It must have felt like they lost him again and again. He went off to war, he came back just a changed person, and then of course, the separation. Your poor mum and her siblings in that as well. We know, don't we, in our work about generational trauma as much as, there's obviously been some form of PTSD and trauma that he's experiencing, but the way that just then spreads out to anybody that he comes into contact with. It's so sad. That whole generation, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The ripple effect, really. So I can't imagine how many families were re-traumatized by those loved ones coming back in a completely different psychological state with shell shock, which is what they'd have been referred to as, so in terms of the conditions. So that kind of began that thing for me at a very young age. But I think one of the things that sticks out in my mind about personality. So I was very lucky. I was pretty good at sport. So when I started going to school, that kind of transmitted onto the football pitch and the cricket pitch and athletics and all the rest of it. And it grew my confidence as a young person, as a kid. So outwardly, I was very confident, but I was quite shy. I was quite shy with girls growing up as a sort of a junior school person and so on. But because I was always very good at sport, I attracted quite a lot of attention, which I liked. But I remember going to a secondary school, and everyone, of course, thinks that much bigger than you because they are, and so on. And we used to play, they used to let you play football in the playgrounds. There were two playgrounds in those days. There was one for boys and one for girls, which was kind of weird. Yeah, but they all stuck to it. We'd go into the girls sometimes, but it was quite rough and rumbustious and all that kind of. It was a typical secondary school in a kind of post Second World War new town villages and so on. So in the boys' playground, you could play ball games. So we'd run around playing football with a tennis ball. You weren't allowed a proper football. And as the younger ones, we'd be running about. And one particular lunchtime, we were having a full-on game, and there was lots of lads, out there. And I remember chasing this tennis ball to try and have a shot or something. And I ran into a brick wall, except it wasn't a brick wall. It was the school tough nut, whose name was Danny. And we'll call him Danny Smith for the sake of this one. That wasn't his real surname. So I ran into this brick wall and landed on my backside, and like a few sort of stuff, and the playground went completely silent. And anyway, I got up. I looked up like at this very large, to me at that time, kind of giant of a lad, and it was Danny. And I sort of looked at him, and he stared at me, and I grinned at him, and I just said, "Are you all right?" And he ruffled my hair. I always remember he ruffled my hair like that. And then it was like everyone thought, it's going to be fine. He's not going to kill him. And all the sounds started again. And I always remember that. Now, the reason that sticks in my mind is because not long after that, probably about a year after that, now Danny was in old school terms, he was in the fourth year. Yeah. So he went in the second year, and then he had the third, the fourth, and the fifth year. So even though he was in the fourth year, so he wasn't even in the top year, he was the hardest kid in the school. And sometimes some of the fifth year ones would try and pick fights with him outside the school gates and all those sort of old school things. And he beat all of them. So he was very much the toughest kid in the school. So they were all scared of him, including most of the teachers, by the way. But about a year later, so whenever we used to pass by in the corridor or something, he'd always wink at me and smile and look at, and I'd just say hello. And my sort of peers would say, "How do you know here? What's going on there? Are you friends with Danny?" And all this. I was in a class. I think it might have been technical drawing or something like that. And I had a very old school, officious kind of teacher. And Danny was always on detention because he just couldn't settle into classes. And he clearly had family issues at home because the head of history was a lovely Welsh lady. She loved him and gave him time. But anyway, I was doing some stuff in the stockroom during technical drawing, and he was on a detention in there, doing whatever it was he had to do. And we started to have a conversation. I remember it clearly because he clearly didn't get a chance really to talk to anyone, probably because most of them were too scared of him to talk to him. But there I was, stuck with him in this room. And so I didn't have any choice. And we had this kind of strange rapport, which was non-verbal up to that point, like I said. And I struck up a conversation with him, and he began to tell me about his father. And his father was in the army. He had another brother, and life wasn't very good. His father wasn't a very nice individual, and Danny clearly had it very tough growing up. And I just sat and I listened to him, and I found myself just asking him the odd I was wondering, I was curious about why he was like he was. I can't read anything into that all those years ago, but something clicked between us, and he was very open about certain things in terms of his life, and some of those things weren't very nice. And we spent half an hour in this room having this conversation. And then it was over and we cracked on all the rest of it. And of course, the following year, he left. He left the school. And I found out, sadly, subsequently, some years later, that there was an article in the local newspaper that he'd taken his own life.
Oh.
And I tried to imagine what sort of life he would have had post school, and did he have a job, and did he have relationships or whatever, but clearly he was a troubled young man, and the chances are he probably didn't get any help to help him through that. So in a ultimately tragic kind of story, that was my introduction to this kind of life, where upon after that I seemed to just, I was a bit of a magnet, so I kind of attracted people, not necessarily the school tough nuts. Sometimes it was girls, which was great. Sometimes it was other boys, which was annoying. But if they had stuff they wanted to get off the chest, they always seemed to come to me. I don't know why. I didn't have the answers, but I evidently was a good listener. And I suppose that's where it all started off.
And interested. It sounds like you were interested in what Danny had to say as well. You used the word curious, but there's something very special, isn't there, for especially somebody in terms of the way you describe Danny in particular. Doesn't sound like maybe he'd often had people that just seemed genuinely interested in him. And is that fair to say?
I think, as I said, I think it was the head of history, Mrs. Jones, her name was. She was a lovely, wonderful Welsh lady, and I can remember she had a real soft spot for him, and she tried to get him to. She knew he wasn't going to be academic. I never witnessed him in a class because he was that much older than me. But I've thought about it subsequently. And he might have had ADHD or something like that.
Yeah.
He could have had some neurodiversity. He could have been dyslexic. I never got it out of him because I never thought to ask him. But he couldn't settle in a class, and he was all disruptive. But she found a way of channeling him and doing other things that he got something from that were not academic. She did used to champion him somewhat. And I guess you mentioned the interested part. So I suppose what I was getting at there was that in because I wasn't scared of him. I was curious about what made him tick. Why was he always having a fight? Things like that. And sometimes it was because the other kids, other students would try and call him out and challenge him, which wasn't necessarily his fault. But why did he always need to do that? And violence for him was like nothing really.
Yeah,
it was just like having a sandwich. But then one has to consider for him to be desensitized like that. One can imagine what he went home to, right?
Of course, absolutely. And Simon, isn't it funny again? As young teenagers, we don't overly think this stuff. We just do. We just respond. You notice that there's something going on between you. He's not singling you out to bully or provoke you at all. There just seems to be something there, and it's only years later that clearly you look back at what a defining moment, or one of the defining moments that was for you in understanding yourself. And actually, you're also making me think, you said, I don't know what happened to him after school, when he would have left school. And of course, we know even now, never mind particularly back then, how people like that would have been sort of spat out of the education system, sort of pretty much forgotten about, left to their own devices. And obviously we'll come on to your work in a short while, but, you know, would he have been sat there on the dole, you know, claiming and not really knowing what he was worth or what could be out there for him?
I think there could be, you could flick a coin up, and I would suspect that it would either have been down that road, or he possibly might join the army or something like that.
Yeah.
That was my kind of hunch, because, you know, sometimes even with poor role models in life, we find ourselves following that pathway, right?
Yeah.
So maybe channeling in, but I'm sad. Yeah, I was very sad when he would have been. When did I hear that news? Probably in my mid-20s, so he'd have been, 2-3 years older than that. So he wouldn't have even seen 30. So yeah, I think, even getting ready for this call, I thought about that one, because it's not something that I put on the notes that I sent to you, but it kind of popped up for me. When I work and with my team, and the people we work with day to day, we're always looking for the seeds of the origins of things within a person, right? So where were those seeds sown? Now, though in the work that we do, we're looking for more often than not seeds that are negatively sown. Otherwise they wouldn't be sat with us in the first place.
Yeah.
But with the things that I'm describing to you, these are my own personal seeds, and how they were sown. We talked about the curiosity of what makes you tick, and change with my grandfather. You kind of got to know me a little bit, and you, I think, recognise that I don't like it if people say no when they have no reason to say no, or they really should be saying yes. And invariably, when it's those sorts of conversations, it's me having a conversation with somebody because I want to do good things, and I want things to improve, or I want government policy to change or be binned, or things like that. So I have a low level of tolerance for people that flannel, or people that aren't real, and so forth. Now, I might with my therapy hat on, with people that aren't being real, have consideration about why that is, and what they're hiding behind, and so I could get into them in that sense were I to be their therapist. But invariably, these are people that are getting in my way when I'm trying to make things better for the kind of folk that we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah. So let's fast track it. A really important part, I feel, if I understand right from what you've said, again, in terms of where you've ended up and the people you advocate for and support now, i.e. the unemployed, that experience was then repeated a couple more times in your life in different ways. Am I right in terms of redundancy or losing your work? So if we could put those all together, I'm sure they were all different in their own way. What did that leave you with then, Simon, personally and professionally? What impact, I suppose I'm asking, being made unemployed 3 times, whether there was just a short gap between moving on to a new role or not, it sort of...
I think the nature of unemployment is so profound, and it doesn't matter where you are in life, because it when it first happens, it's an immense shock. So the 3 redundancies I had in a very truncated way. The first one I've just described to you was voluntary. The second one, the job that I went to and stayed for 2 years, a contract was lost. The guy that I was working for was my best mate. As a publisher, I was a writer. he left the country because he couldn't tell me that two people had to go and I was one of them, and that was immediate. So I left again. I walked on the day. I walked out. I didn't go back. So again, no closure there. And then I went through a period of working in contract temporary employment, and I worked for a period for Pfizer, and they've got a fabulous European head office down in Walton Oaks in Surrey. And I came up against this thing. As I said before, I'm not a graduate. I don't have a degree. And in pharmaceuticals, they had the best learning and development department I'd ever come across, other than one that I worked for before, those few years before, as I mentioned. And I'd stayed with them as a temp for 2.5 years. They were fabulous. They had their own gym there. It was just the greatest working environment. Everybody very intelligent, but very compassionate people, and very clever people. But because I didn't have a degree, I couldn't get in there. And it was terrible, and I had lots of other things going on at the same time, but I couldn't bring myself to leave because I was hankering after staying there because I loved it so much. But in the end, I had to leave. I got back on the saddle, and I had a senior job in London for a law firm, doing all those lovely things. But they got taken over, and I was put on gardening leave. And for those of you that don't know what that is, you basically get paid to sit at home while they decide what they're going to do with you, and then in the end, invariably, they give you the bullet and you go. And that's what happened to me for 9 months. So my wife was out working every day. We had 3 very small children at the time. I was doing all the school stuff that I'd always done anyway, but I had a lot of time to think and a lot of time to get depressed, which I did. And I put a set of numbers, I think, on the bio, didn't I? But for the benefit of anybody watching. So I do a talk about this stuff fairly frequently when they ask me, all over the place. And one of the opening thing is 9:14. So the number 9 and then 14. It's not a biblical reference or anything like that. It's about the first day that I went into a job centre to sign on, as you had to do in those days. So I'm going back, a good chunk of time now. But it's important. So they're in leafy Epsom in Surrey. Fabulous place. If you're going to sign on anywhere, it's not a bad place to do it, although there's no parking. So on my very first appointment, I had nowhere to park. I was quite nervous. I'd never done it before, anything like that. Went in and sat down, and they called me up immediately, and I walked across, and the chap sitting behind the desk, we'll call him Steve. He rolled his sleeve up and he pointed his watch at me and he tapped it like that. And I said, "What's going on here?" And I looked, and it said 9:14. That's nothing, you might think. However, my appointment was at 9:10. And so those 4 minutes got me a bit of a telling off and a bit of a dressing down publicly, when just a few months before I'd held a very, very significant budget for professional development in London for a bunch of lawyers and whatnot. And then I was 4 minutes late and I got an absolute slapping down in the job centre. Now, that was quite tough to take, particularly as I was depressed enough as it was. And I found myself in a situation where, in the end, I had a mortgage protection policy, which is supposed to keep you safe for a year, but you have to go and still look and find a job, which I wasn't able to do. And so the dilemma that I found myself in was the job centre ultimately were going to refuse to stamp my mortgage protection, which meant I couldn't pay my mortgage and would lose my home. Or if I got a job, which they encouraged me to do at a lower level of salary, I could get that job in a heartbeat, but not be earning enough to pay my mortgage. Therefore, I'd lose my house. So I was going to lose my house, whatever happened.
It's caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, perhaps 1 or 2 rocks and 1 or 2 hard places. But that was my first experience of being unemployed, and only experience of being unemployed. And the pressure mentally on me as a male, as a dad, as a person that had always been in employment, Also, the sense of not just loss, but your loss of who you are. So I can remember going into nursery to pick up one or two of my kids, and I've done it, fairly regularly anyway. I was hands-on sort of dad. But shamefully, I found myself lying to the other parents when they were asking me what, was all right. I was just saying, I've just got a day off. But you can only have so many days off.
Yeah.
Before I couldn't bring myself to tell them that I'd lost my job and I couldn't get back into it. So my kind of journey around my own mental health and so on, and realization that, unless you ask for help, you're going to be in a bit of trouble, began at that point, I guess. And I didn't recognize it in myself immediately. My wife did, unsurprisingly. But I found myself at periods during that time, very, very much lost. Once I dropped the kids off at school, I would go back home and I would just sit. I'd have a coffee. I'd get stuff ready for the evening meal and whatnot. And didn't really know what to do with myself. So that stayed with me. And although I went to see my GP at the time, I had a short period of antidepressants. That was fine. I'm not neither for or against it. It's at the right time for me, just for a few months, and that was it. And I found my own pathway back to good health. But what was clear to me was the lack of support for unemployed people clinically, as well as everything else, particularly men, but not specifically just for men. And some years later, we moved to Devon here in the southwest, and that stayed with me. That experience stayed with me because although I did get back on the horse, as it were, we wanted to relocate. I did my clinical training and so forth, and the people that I felt almost a duty to go and help were particularly the longer term unemployed people. And many of whom I became friends with in the time that I was going into Epsom waiting to be called up. And so I created a service. I persuaded my then employer at the time down here in South Devon to bankroll me for a year, because I can be quite persuasive like that. And I popped across the road to the local job centre and I said to them, right, at the time there was an employability program called the Work Program, which was for people with disabilities in particular and longer term unemployed. And you essentially would be offered the chance to go on that for a year, and you'd be working with a separate organisation. They would upskill you, retrain you, all that kind of stuff. And you didn't have to sign on for a year. So lots of people went on it, but then they would just go on this loop. They wouldn't get the psychological support that they needed, and they'd end up back 12 months hence signing on again for another period, and then they'd do it again. So my message to them over there was, look, you can send me anyone you want. They can be former work program returners, they can be people that have been on that sort of stuff multiple times. Essentially anyone that, sadly, metaphorically speaking, DWP had thrown in the waste paper bin. Yeah. Send them across. And that's what they did. So they would have 6 sessions of what we would now call talking therapy, counselling essentially. Yeah. But we called it practical and psychological support, or I called it that, because I know that if I'd said to DWP I was giving them talking therapies, they'd have kicked me out the door, right? Yeah. Long story short, many people that came across the river where we worked and where my practice was woke up. They remembered who they are. They began to work on the things that troubled them most. And for a good deal of them, when they were finding themselves in somewhat better psychological shape and more confident and so on, and had ironed out a number of the issues that were troubling them, they were ready to get a job. And the guy that I persuaded, shall we say, to bankroll me was a recruiter at a recruitment company. So they could then go across to his team, who would help introduce them to employers, and they found jobs. Now, after about 4 months, I got summoned across to talk to the seniors at the job centre over the road, because they couldn't understand what I was doing with these people. And when I asked them why, other than the obvious, because some of them were getting jobs and not signing on anymore, even the people that they'd absolutely given up on were scrubbing up. They were coming in. They were better presented. They were curious about what might be possible for them and things like that. And that's how it started. And I must just take this moment just quickly to mention someone who was a very big advocate of our services. I can't give his name because he's very sadly took his life a couple of years ago. But he spent his whole life supporting people with disabilities as part of a DWP employee. And every year we award to our most proficient practitioner, let's call it that, a special award. And like I said, I can't name him on here because of what happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's in my thoughts right now, because without his support, we might not have got into that job centre. And if we hadn't got into that job centre, I wouldn't have given up, because I don't give up. But he made that help possible. So, we honour him every year. And obviously the team remember who he is. But so that's just a shout out to that dear old friend of mine. But what happened after that was our results became very well known in South West, and everybody wanted a piece of it. And ultimately, we were introduced to a couple of prime contractors. And for those people that don't really know about employability on this podcast, whichever government's in power through the Treasury and the DWP will put in large amounts of money to prime contractors who can essentially roll out services nationally that are all consistent and compatible to help longer term unemployed people back into work. And despite what you might hear in the press these days about some of these things, they work incredibly well, incredibly hard. And we work with people like Reed in partnership, with Maximus, with CTEC down here in the South West where I live, and with the Growth Company. And Working Minds is the company that I set up all those years ago. I walked into Barclays Bank in Plymouth with a £2,000 personal overdraft. I never took a penny from any soul, including European Social Fund. I probably should have done, but didn't. So Working Minds was born all those years ago. We're 11 this year. And we went from just me. There are 42 of us up and down England and Wales now, providing talking therapeutic support for longer term unemployed people particularly, and those who are on health programs as well, including hopefully in a minute the National Diabetes Prevention program. We work on a thing called Restart, which is a national employability contract, and then some newer stuff coming up. Connect to Work is a new one. The current government have funded, and so on. So we've worked with thousands of people since inception, continue to do so, and our job is to work with their mental health conditions. They don't have to have a formal diagnosis. They can diagnose themselves if you like, but it's those people that are finding obstacles to moving forward. So our job is to stabilise and to improve using metrics and so on, and to facilitate them the opportunity and the personal growth and lots of recovery. So you can imagine we uncover lots of things, whether that's child sexual abuse survivors of domestic violence, bullying, all manner of stuff, and that evidence base is very, very powerful, and it's used from time to time in the media. It's used by DWP when they ask us something and so on. So it's very close to my heart, as you can tell.
Yeah, that's become more and more clear as our conversations progress, Simon. And And actually, I suppose, if I'm honest, it surprises me to hear. Maybe it's just not something I've listened to or read enough about. I don't know it. And I wonder about people listening to this, to hear that actually there is funding for this sort of thing, i.e. governmental funding to support people that are unemployed, but particularly to do that in a therapeutic sense, is really good to hear. But I know there's a big however. Is that what you're just coming to?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So there's funding for employability. Okay?
Yeah.
So there's funding for training and so on and so forth. DWP Direct also funds stuff direct. But we were the first organisation that offered talking therapies to long-term unemployed. Loads of others have got on the bandwagon since, but we were the first. That's the first thing. The second thing is the government, when the current government got in, they had an opportunity to extend the work and health programme. They didn't do that. Yeah. So we have Restart still. We currently don't have a specific employability scheme, if you like, or provision for people with disabilities, and that is very important. So I've been lobbying to get this looked at. Again, others doing the same, and it's important that we press on with that stuff to make some things happen. Because again, the notion that you hear on the media. I work with yourselves, as you know, and also with another body when it comes to media work, and I'm forever reminding those people that the vast majority of people out there, they do not want to be on benefits. But they need, many of them need psychological support. They need talking therapy, and we continue to push and prod and promote and shout about that, because the other thing that we're doing in the work that we do is the secondary gain is social value. So for every person that we work with, and we run a standard 6-session short form stuff, solution focused work, but for every person that we work with in that space, they don't have to go on an NHS waiting list. And I don't know what it's like where you are, or where any of you guys watching are, but the high line now for waiting to see a counsellor is 2 years.
Yeah.
If you go via, as we all would, via primary healthcare, if you're not going privately. So 2 years, get your head around that, everyone. If they come to see us through an employability scheme, and I can convince the people holding budgets to enable that to happen, they can see us within 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So if you're a longer term unemployed person, you ain't going to wait 2 years. You're not even going to bother. You're just going to sit and stew in your own juice. And yeah, that's what we're about. That's essentially the heartbeat. We are working on other things, as you know, but that's our core business, and that will remain so.
And there's so much, isn't there, in this summit about somebody having purpose and self-worth and things like that. That being employed, I think, isn't just about those basics that we all understand and know of money and things like that. But we know just how much that can help us as individuals' confidence and esteem when we feel that sense of purpose, a sense of contributing to something, achieving something, all of those other things that come with it. And you are at the beginning of that journey and helping people move into that space more so for themselves.
When you work with this cohort, and they are from every age and stage, the length and breadth of the UK, and some of these people have grown up in a generationally unemployed environment.
Yeah. So
they have no role models that their parents were unemployed.
Yeah. Maybe
the generation before that even. So it is quite extraordinary when you sit down with some people. They don't have a no. So they when we talk about self-determination and autonomy and all of these things that many of us can take for granted because we haven't been through it to the extent that they have. It's almost incomprehensible because neurologically, I don't know. I'm fascinated by neurological stuff, and neurologically, I don't know what that must do in terms of your own neurological development. If you have no aspiration because you don't even know what that is, and you certainly probably can't even spell it, okay, because you've had very poor education, you have nothing really to aspire to at all. And let me tell you, we have 16% of 16 to 24-year-olds unemployed right now, and that to me is beyond tragic. Is shameful, and not on the people that are unemployed, but on the powers that be to
Absolutely.
to not really push, not the command and control thing. They should be enabling more people such as ourselves through innovative schemes that are not designed to push and pressure, but is designed to give people space in a solution-focused manner, so we can be, cautiously directive sometimes, but it works. And therefore, there are missed opportunities, and I'll never give up. I'll never stop until we have newer solutions in place. The solutions are already here. They just need to be enabled through further funding, and it's not because there's no money there, it's because there's a lot of money wasted. There's no point in throwing multiple millions of pounds at people, training them in health hygiene or food hygiene or something like that, when they're struggling with multiple psychological obstacles that were the seeds of which were sown in childhood, and now they're 40 years of age and they haven't worked for 20 years. The food hygiene courses are not going to cut the mustard. What's going to cut the mustard is some, specifically defined talking therapeutic support, which they don't have to wait 2 years to access.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're very much aligned, aren't we, in that sense of that army of practitioners to which we belong that are out there that can be brought into this if somebody saw the way to do that even more so. And I know obviously through Working Minds, yeah, exactly, you are a part of that. And actually, so it's probably a good place. So you've talked about men in the sense of being unemployed. You've just mentioned young people. I think many of us are aware of everything that's going on for our young people at the moment and the difficulties there. And actually, even those that are educated, that are coming out of university with student loans, coming up to their eyeballs. And then obviously, we've got people with disabilities. There's all manner of other, aspects to this that come into this, aren't there? But one aspect that I know you're also about to do some work with is with modern day slavery, isn't it? And supporting people in that context. Can you just give us a brief outline about that work that's...
Well, there's going to be some people on this watching this podcast now that are going to be thinking, or maybe even saying out loud, now we've written to Simon or we've written to Working Minds about that and we haven't heard anything back, and so on and so forth. So although I put it in writing out on the last magazine, first of all, can I take this opportunity to send my profound apologies for the delay in getting back to you, and let me just take a second or two to explain why. I've written it down, but I'll do it now you've given me the opportunity. The process this is a Home Office program, and the process is very long. And we wanted to put something out, and we've got no qualms about doing that, to gain some interest and see what people, if there were people out there that were interested in coming along, particularly those that are multilingual.
Yeah.
because it's very important for us to, as far as I'm concerned, to be able to work with people that have survived trafficking and that have managed to be rescued out and through those horrific systems that sadly continue to grow and proliferate out there. But those people that are now in a safer territory, in a safer space, are going to be horribly traumatized, and they're going to be, holding multiple issues. And my personal belief and view is that it's going to be far easier for those people to be able to work in a safer and more compassionate way, a more effective way, by doing so in the language that suits them.
Yeah.
It might be English, but it's more likely to be in their mother tongue. And that's why we put the call out there. We had an extraordinary response, north of 400 emails just blew up. Now, the process itself takes, as I said, it takes a long time. So I'm happy to say we're with our prime partner, who unfortunately I can't name. We're on a non-disclosure, but our prime partner. So we're through to the last four. Those final submissions going in April, and then the decision is made and awarded in August, and then there is a full 12 months to put the service in place to start in August 27. So you can see it's a very elongated, but it needs to be. So, but what I want to say to anyone out there that's put their name forward, we've got all the details. We are going to begin a process of reaching out to you, because I'm very committed to creating a new team of multilingual therapists that can help support particularly vulnerable communities in our society now. So even if we're not successful in this particular bid, that's still my aim. So I will be, and my team will be getting back to you guys one way or another, because we will be looking to see if we can't or we're unable to bring that new team skills to bear within the Victims of Modern Slavery programme. We will be looking to utilise that team to do other things. For example, there's a lot of money being spent on courses for people where English is their second language. So it's called ESOL. But we have notification from some of our partners that run those particular schemes, that again, a lot of the participants that are on it have psychological trauma and so forth as a result of what they've been through. So we can do it that way as well. So we will be doing this thing one way or another, because I'm quite determined to do that. So please watch this space and please be patient. Thank you so much for being patient up to this point. We will get back to you soon, one way or the other.
And there's one thing you've shown, I think, certainly today in this conversation, and that's when you're determined to do something, things tend to happen. So, so watch this space, everybody. Now, we are in line, if we haven't already got there, to be one of the longest records so far. So I am going to, before I thank you and we bring it to a close, whenever I am liaising with guests for the podcast, Simon, one of the things I often ask them to do is, tell me a little bit about themselves beforehand, and themes we want to chat about. And very often I'll ask them about, how do they decompress, or tell me a bit about their life outside of being a practitioner and their clinical work and all that sort of thing. Again, that sort of human side of it. Now, I'm not sure I even necessarily even asked you that bit, and yet still you were able to mention to me about script writing and stand-up. So we're going to jump from the important themes of things like victims of modern day slavery and the amazing work you do to support the unemployed. And I'm going to just ask you very briefly, stand up, what's that all about?
Well, this is historical stuff, to be fair.
You mean you're not still doing it?
Well, I kind of tinker around the edges, but listen, there used to be. This will just highlight perhaps again a little bit about me and how I role, I suppose. So there used to be a program. There used to be a satellite TV station or whatever in Canary Wharf, and I think it was on every day, but they'd have stand up on every day. And I can remember getting back in from the pub one night and on a Friday, and they had these people on there, and they were rubbish as far as I was concerned. I like observational stuff, but they were terrible. And they said at the end, there's always a thing at the end. It said, if you think you can do better than this, call this number and get yourself up here, right? So on the Monday, I sat in the office. This is going back to the legal and general days, and I rang the number, and they not expecting them to pick it up during the day, and they picked it up, and I explained who I was, and they said, "Well, okay, when you know, so have you got a routine and that?" And I'm saying, "Yeah, yeah." They said, "Can you do Friday?" I said, "Which Friday?" They said, "This Friday." So that was on the Monday. I had no material. I hadn't timed. I had 10 minutes. So I had 4 days to write some material, to rehearse it in front of a mirror in my house with an old egg timer, and then get myself over to Canary Wharf and do this thing, which I did. And I did take some friends with me, but they all seemed to laugh and like it and all the rest of it. And claim to fame on that one was the compere, who I didn't really like very much. His best claim to fame was that he was Gary Oldman's best mate.
No, that's a name for people of a certain age.
Subsequently, I did go on and do stuff, and I it's not a claim to fame. I used to do a thing called the Banana Cabaret in London. And I was once on a bill, and the pub landlord was actually lower on the bill than me. There you go.
Oh,
Al Murray, right?
Al Murray,
So
yeah.
So there you go.
Simon, thank you so much. What an absolute pleasure to spend this time with you, even if it was a little bit longer than than anticipated.
Should have done a part 2. That would have been all right.
Thank you to Simon for joining us today, and thank you for listening in. This podcast is brought to you by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, a professional home for counsellors, psychotherapists, and over 120 wellbeing organisations across the UK. Autonomy, diversity, creativity and community are at the heart of what we do. We're creating a positive space for conversations with people who share common beliefs and goals, because together our voice is louder. If you would like to know more about the NCPS, please visit www.ncps.com for more information. And please remember to follow and subscribe to this podcast so you're always part of the conversation.